Angular Orange here with a tutorial on template-driven forms. And in this tutorial, we're going to create a project called Forms Template-Driven Validation. And that will consist of a root app component, which has a template showing a username, a password, and confirmed password, and maybe an SSN number. And then we will introduce some validation. One validation form would be a form group validator directive that validates whether the password and the confirmed password are equal. This should get you more familiar with form group validators. Then we'll also use some built-in validator, like a minimum length built-in validator, to ensure the username is at least 8 characters in length. We'll log the validation results. Let's say when we submit the form, we'll log it. When there's errors on the form, we'll display them on the form. So let's go to the application code and take a look. Let's just first make sure I'm in the project. I've started the server, so that's good news. Now let's go to the application, and here's my Forms Template-Driven Validation project that I created with Angular CLI. The reason why I don't do it interactively in the video is it takes a long time. The nodes modules is very long, and so it creates all those node modules that you need. But just like any other project, I go to the Angular CLI JSON file, and I see the structure of my application, where my output directory is, where my root source directory is. But the main focus here is on the index, the style sheet associated with the index, and the main TypeScript driver. So I immediately go to look at those files. I look at the index.html. There's a custom app root tag there. So that's my root app component that I display loading ... before it gets bootstrapped and loaded and renders. And then of course I have the style sheet, which there's nothing in there. The main.ts driver imports an enable prod mode from the core, and that just basically would turn off assertions if you're not running in development mode. But we are running in development mode. We want to see everything we possibly can while we're developing and unit testing our application. Then we have a platform browser dynamic, which is imported from another Angular package called platform browser dynamic, and that thing bootstraps my app module. The app module is my custom app module, which runs it really defines my Angular application module. So I import that from a file that I defined called app.module, and actually the WebStorm project created that for me by default. So so then I go and look at that, because that's my next custom component. Okay, so here's your application module. Okay, so what do? We have a browser module. We import an ng module for the annotation, a forms module that we use for forms, and we have an app component. Now notice the forms module we're importing supports template-driven forms. If we're building a reactive forms module, we would have to import reactive forms module, but we're not. Okay, we're focusing on template-driven here. We have an app component, which is a custom component. We have an Ssn Validator and equal validator directive. So notice in my ng module, my declarations, I have custom components that I've built. I'm importing the forms module. I'm bootstrapping my app component, and that's all I really need to know with my app module, what this thing does. So I immediately see here that I have 3 custom components, and I am using template-driven forms. Okay, so let's go to the component and take a look at that. Okay, so like I said with template-driven forms, you build the template using directives, and then you pump the submitted data back to the back end. Okay, so that's a simple way you can view template-driven forms. It's always that way. Okay, so basically, however, the component, the app component, the root component, associates a template with it and a style sheet with it and a selector with it. It's a component template you're dealing with. It's really a component template. So you have to think of them as a combined component. So really, you really should look at the template first. That's the thing you design, and when you submit, you're pumping it to the back end backing object. But let's just look at the backing object right away. Okay, you export a class called app component, and you have an onSubmit method, and that thing takes the form value, which is really the form. It's a JSON. Its type is any. It's the JSON object, and then there's an isFormValid Boolean, which also gets passed in. So here I'm saying my onSubmit method takes a JSON input and whether the form is valid or not. And if it's valid, I'm going to log it. Okay, so now let's take a look at the template. Now, before I leave this, just point out that you're submitting to a function and you're getting the JSON value. That's as simple as it gets. I could also pass out the data if I want to, but the real work here is in the template. Of course, you could be calling a web service and all that other stuff, so there could be a lot of work here. But okay, so let's look at the form. You have a form. Now Angular tries to control every form. The form tag is really converted to Angular, but we have to specify we don't want the browser validating this, so we say no validate. We're going to do our own validation. We use directives in the form to, this is an export as f. Oops, let me replace that. Export the form as a variable f locally in my template. And therefore on the submit event, we pass the value of that form to the submit function. So this is very important here, that the form is exported as a variable, which I now locally have access to in my template. And so I could do a .value to get the JSON value. I could do a .valid to see if the form is valid. Okay, and the other thing that's you do in template-driven forms is you map the input fields using ngModel. So you know the f is a JSON object. The f.value is a JSON object. Now I have to put ngModel everywhere to denote the fact of which attributes or form controls are actually part of that JSON object. So that's where the ngForm model comes in. Now the name is really important. It's mandatory that you have a name, username here, and that's how these names are mapped to JSON attributes, JSON object attributes. Okay, so that's simple enough. And notice you got your button here to submit, but during this submit event, this directive says map the ngSubmit event to the invocation of this function on the back end. Okay, now the other thing we have to do is we have different type of validation here. We have this built-in validation saying this attribute is required. And it's required, and if it's not required, then we're going to display username is required. Now, the way you do that is with the exported variable f.form. If it has error, you negate it, it would be false. So hidden would be false. So this would be displayed. Okay, so you say the form has error, and you say you're looking at the required validation rule, and you're looking at the username attribute. So this is pretty straightforward. And also down here, your minimum length of 0 for the password. It's pretty straightforward. Now, the reason why we're doing this particular model, notice up here on this attribute, I have this attribute here, Ssn. This is my validator. When I define this validator, I defined it to be an attribute, and I could use it in the input field, putting the attribute here, and therefore this input field would be validated with that Ssn validator. And then once again, the exported variable f form has error, the Ssn for this Ssn attribute name. If it is invalid, if there is an error, that would be true, and the negation of it would be false. So this hidden would be false. So this would display. So that's pretty straightforward too. Just the question is how we implemented Ssn, which is the validator for a social security number, and we had to code that up. Okay, now the other thing, so we looking at the usage of a validator up here. The other thing is the usage of a group validator. And so what I do is I do an ng model group, and I group the passwords. I call it passwords group, and that is validated here. And basically, in this div tag, there's 2 input fields, and this passwords group validator is going to validate the password groups. And once again, here in this particular field here, there's a minimum length validation, and there's also a password group validation. So, and notice down here with the pconfirm, I'm just doing an equal validator on the password group. So let's take a look at what that code looks like. I guess I should have showed you a couple things. Okay, so I got 2 validators. So let's look at the first one. We got an Ssn validator. I import a directive, a form control, and an ng validators from Angular Forms. And I define a function called Ssn Validator. And it takes a form control, and it looks at the control value, and it matches it to certain pattern, and if it returns valid. If it's true, it returns null, else it returns Ssn as true. Now here's the thing. This thing returns a key and an object, and in this case the object could be null or it could be Ssn as true, but this Ssn as true really means its validation failed. So only in the case where I return null would it be valid. Okay, so then I create this directive, and I use the selector Ssn, and I put it in this square bracket with the mean attribute. So my selector is an attribute. It's called Ssn, and you could use that as a validator in your code. And you define the provider to be an ng_validators provider, and you use this value Ssn validator. I say multi equals true, which means I could use multiple validators, but then I have to export a class called Ssn Validator directive. So we define the directive, it points to the function. We also use this ng validators to define basically the value used for the validator. And then notice that the Ssn Validator, really we inject a form control into it to do the validation. So this, even though straightforward, a little bit confusing. Do I like directives as validators? Not necessarily. If you're going to do some complicated forms, use reactive forms. It's probably a better bet, but this is simple enough. Okay, so let's go take a look at that on the front end. Okay, so what's going on with Ssn Validator? Oh, I could put a different character. It's probably counting the number of characters and the fact of whether I'm using an alpha character or not. So that's good. Let's see if we use a simple password, whether we submit's called. It's not, doesn't seem to be logging the object, which is troubling me a little bit, or I think it's because of this. I think this had minimum characters. Okay, I think this is it. Okay, so it did log the object, and I have a password group here, which is my password and confirm password. Don't do this at home. You never show a password in a log file. And my username is this. Let's see what happens when I change the username. Still log the object. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at the other validator. Okay, so this is a simple validator with a directive and a function and using a form control. Notice this is the form control is injected into your validator once you did this. Attribute, validator selector is an attribute. It injected this control into the function call. Okay, let's look at the equal validator. Okay, so that once again is a directive, a form group. You import an ng validators. You have an equal validator, and this also gets a form group. And notice this, I do something a little bit fancy here. This is TypeScript. TypeScript allows you to get the value of the form group using this syntax with curly brackets. So if you have an event, you could use the curly brackets to get the value, the target of the event, whatever. And so I'm simplifying this here. Instead of taking the form group and getting the value, here I'm just passing in the value. That's fancy stuff. Notice my directive has an equal. Left square bracket, right square bracket means I could use the equal as a directive, as an attribute of the form tag. And then the providers, I use the value equal validator, and I defined equal validator directive down here. Okay, so now this is an equal validator. All I have to do is confirm that the password and the confirmed password are equal. And I did some overkill here with the implementation. I take the value, which is, it's really a JSON object, and I take the keys associated with that value. And if the value is not defined, I use this empty object. But I take the keys and I take the first property and I put it in a first variable, and I take the rest of the variables and I put it in this rest array, and then to check whether it's valid, I compare the first with every element in that array. So for each element, I look at the value and make sure it's identically equal to the value of the first element. And if it's valid, I return null. If it's not, I say equal is true. Like I said, I just needed to compare the two, the password and the confirmed password values. I didn't have to go through all this trouble. I'm just showing you a little bit of TypeScript, the rest operator here, which is an ES6 function. Okay, so let's let's go and now take another look. Let's take a look and see how we use this thing in the component template. I used okay, so yeah, I'm not liking something over here, so let's just see what I did. Password group. ng model is password group. Okay, so did I have a password group here? Okay, I defined the model group as password group, and then I put the validator as equal. So here's my equal attribute in my model group, and this equal validator, this attribute basically boils down to a validator, right? It's an equal attribute. It boils down to a equal validator, and I'm validating on this password group. So I will show an error in the event that there's a password group error. Okay, so let's take a look at the code to see whether that's even functioning right. These things are not perfect, but okay, so let's refresh. That's not good. Okay, so let's take a look at what's going on here. Username is required, so as long as I put in a username, it's valid. The social security number is required. Now I'm going to put a password. I'm going to say it's Godzilla. And then I submit. And here is my password group object and my SSN number, my username, and here's my password group data. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to show you. The only other thing is, the only other thing is if I did something wrong here and I submitted, that form being is valid would show up false. So where I did this is form valid, it's going to wind up being false, and we could verify that too. Let's just quickly do this. And let's see what happens. So notice my code is recompiling again, and now I do this, admin 090556677. Let's see, and my password was Godzilla 2. Submit. Okay, it didn't get logged. So let me make a bigger mess of this. I'm gonna fire up npm start again, just to see. And just to convince you that when we got to be very careful when you're using Webpack and Angular CLI and these things. Most of the time, the server is looking for code changes, and when the code changes, the WebSockets would re-render the application. But there's times when there's issues and you have to restart the server, and it's still, I mean, it's still not as bad as it should be. It should improve dramatically, I would think, in the next month or two. But you always have to be concerned with caching in the browser, with the server displaying, rendering properly. So I will wait to see whether this happens properly. So so what did I do? I went here and I wanted to log this particular value coming in as a Boolean, just to show you that this will not be logged. The form value will not be logged if this is false. And when I changed it, it's sort of like the code got recompiled, but it still didn't render the proper result. So we're waiting for that to happen. Let's go and do it again. Make it incorrect and submit it. Okay, so is form valid is false. And if I make it true, once again, look at this caching issue that I have. Let me see one more thing, and I don't mind taking you through this because it's important to try to convince yourself. Is it browser cache? Is it the server I have to restart? What is the problem here? I'm going to tell you my experience is it's always the server. Yes, it's the server. So I'm not gonna bother you with that. Basically, we're going to just end the session here. And like I said, in our course, we go through detailed forms analysis with template-driven forms and reactive forms. So just to summarize what we've done here, and I can't say this enough. Template-driven forms, you define a template. You submit the form to the back of the backing object, and the way you define the attributes in your JSON object you're submitting, it's with ng model, and the way you associate form fields, let's say in an embedded object in the JSON object, you use a model group. So so then you basically go to the app component and you handle that JSON object coming to the back end via a function. Okay, so that's it for template-driven forms. And just remember, template-driven forms, you go to front to backing object. With reactive forms, you go from backing object and then you construct the form. Two totally different things, separate directives, separate APIs, separate modules you use. With forms, with template-driven forms, you use the forms module. With reactive forms, you use the reactive forms module. So just keep that in mind.